1984. In some ways, this is the quintessential dystopian novel. Some people will point to Orwell's Time Machine as the first real dystopia, and this is fair enough. Forrester's The Machine Stops is another great dystopian world. But when we think of dystopias, 1984 set a new bar for how dystopias work and for the ways in which they imagine a future that is so very real and possible, it creeps into our real life existence outside the novel. 1984 was first published in 1949. It was George Orwell's last book. Orwell was an English socialist. He was educated at Eton. He was a very successful writer in his day and very concerned about what he saw during the 30s and 40s in Europe as fascism took hold of the continent, as World War II unfolded, as mass genocide became a feature of what were once considered civilized societies. And he was also worried about what was happening in the wake of World War II. Was the desire to push against what had happened with Mussolini and Hitler and then Stalin in power in the USSR, what was becoming the Soviet Union, did that lead to a different sort of totalitarianism in the West? A shutting down of thought and conversation, where the only sorts of ideas that were good were those that were now being pushed forward as acceptable by the party. Orwell knew that totalitarianism could take multiple forms. He imagines in 1984 a world in which there is constant surveillance, telescreens watch people all the time, even as they receive all of their information from the screens. It's a scary thought, because that's exactly what our phones and our computers are capable of. But Orwell was imagining it before 1950. Through this world of constant surveillance, people are forced into never knowing if they're the one being watched by Big Brother. Yes, 1984 is what gives us the idea of Big Brother. The very scary and yet friendly Big Brother who's always watching you. Some other ideas that came into our world from 1984 are the ideas of NEWSPEAK, words put together to serve political purposes and eliminate the nuance and complexity of language and ideas. Because if you control people's language, then you can control their ideas. If they don't have words to think of certain things, then those things can cease to exist. So NEWSPEAK comes into our culture. The idea of a thought crime, that even our very ideas might be criminal, and that if the state could police these, well then, we could stop crime before it happens. This, of course, went on to be a very mediocre Tom Cruise movie a number of years ago. But it's an interesting idea, right? Are our ideas really the source of all of our problems in society? And wouldn't it be so easy if we could just shut those down before people did bad things? But then what about thought crimes that just go against other people's power and privilege and ease? If you've got the power to control things, well then you could shut down those thoughts too. So 1984 introduces us to thought crime. We also get 2 minutes hate, a ritualized experience of encouraging and practicing communal outrage at things. Orwell saw a future in which a culture of outrage could silence all sort of constructive political discourse. And he imagined that that would be one of the backbones to a world in which all human freedom was utterly quashed by the government. He also introduces us to the equation 2 + 2 = 5. And if you're thinking, hey, that's what I answered on my math test last week, bad news. That's not reality. But in 1984, part of what you have to do is come to a place where you can accept that 2 + 2 = 5. Because what you have to learn to accept is doublethink. Doublethink is the practice of being able to believe that the true and the false are the same thing. So you can hold 2 contradictory notions in your head at the same time as correct. You can even ignore your own sense of reality and say that if this is 2 and this is 2, well, obviously it's 5. Orwell imagines a world in which we purposely shut down our own experiences, our own knowledge, and our own memories, in order to fit in order to toe the party line, and ultimately, in order to survive. How in the world does a society get this sort of power, though? Well, Orwell bases all of his ideas for Big Brother and the telescreens on Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon. So Jeremy Bentham was a utilitarian philosopher. He died in 1832. And he had this idea for a building called a panopticon that would maximize the ability of like bureaucratic institutions to surveil people they needed to surveil. It was kind of like a round building with a guard in the middle who could from that place see all the different parts of the building and all the different rooms. And then this way, because everyone thought they could be being watched at any moment, they would all behave as if they were being watched at every moment and thus would do the right thing all the time. Now, Bentham imagined this sort of architectural design of the panopticon would work really well for things like hospitals, where you need to be monitoring patients all the time and making sure they're, I don't know, not sneaking out of their hospital bed. Sanatoriums, which were institutions to help people like when they were going through rehabilitation processes, but also maybe people suffering from slight mental illness. Asylums, which is of course where the 19th century locked up everyone who kind of didn't fit in some way or other that wasn't a prison. And of course, this would be ideal for prisons because then you could watch all of your inmates all the time. What I find interesting is that Bentham also thought this would be an ideal architectural design for schools, which gives you an idea maybe a little bit about how Bentham thought about education. Yet another form of social restraint and social conditioning. And if all the students think they're being watched all the time, well then they'd behave as good students should. At least that was Bentham's thinking. So the telescreens give Big Brother and the party the power to watch you all the time. You never know if you're being watched. So you don't dare do something like have a covert meeting, start talking about resistance, form interpersonal human relationships, or write. Because writing, of course, can become the ultimate act of resistance in a society like this. Because to write is to insist upon language that isn't necessarily in newspeak, language that might reveal thought crimes, language that might suggest that 2 + 2 isn't 5, no matter what the party tells you. Writing can be a way to record ideas that are contrary to the world around you. And in 1984, that marks you for death. At its core, this novel is about the nature of truth and its manipulation by those with power. It's especially interested in how the truth is manipulated through language and propaganda. And how can we use language to shape realities that are definitely not for the good of everyone. And ultimately, it's about power, especially political power, and the sorts of surveillance necessary to enforce one's position of power. And of course, all of this has to be backed up by torture. Because in the end, it's not just being watched that makes people behave. It's knowing that if you get caught doing the wrong thing, you will suffer greatly and possibly die. That's what really gives the panopticon its teeth. We'll notice as we read that there are very few choices these characters get to make. They have the choice to buy a diary or not buy a diary, to write or not to write. Winston has the choice to be with Julia or not be with Julia. He has the choice to go to O'Brien's. But much of his existence is predetermined for him by the nature of his work and by the state. So it brings up some really interesting questions around ethics. How do you live ethically when you have almost no choices? And when the choices in front of you are usually going to lead to your death, almost no matter which path you choose?